It was an ordinary morning for Alex Carter, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city. A millionaire many times over, Alex had everything anyone could dream of: a sprawling mansion perched on a hill, high-end sports cars parked in a garage that resembled a showroom, and an aura of undeniable charm that made him a regular on the social scene. But today, something felt different. The calm of the morning, with the distant hum of city life below, was interrupted only by the soft clinking of coffee cups as Alex sat at his polished dining table, alone. He flipped through his phone, checking his calendar for the day. A series of meetings with potential investors, a charity event in the evening, and a quiet dinner with a few old friends later in the week. It was all part of the routine that had come to define his life. Alex looked out of the massive windows of his home, surveying the view of the city below. From this height, everything seemed small. The people, the traffic, even the towering office buildings, they were all just pieces of a puzzle he had long since mastered. He smiled to himself, a faint hint of arrogance curling at the corners of his lips. He'd worked hard to get here, and now that he had everything he wanted, nothing and no one could touch him. Except, perhaps, for one thing: boredom. As much as he thrived on success, Alex had always craved something more. Something that would keep him entertained. He wasn't one to settle into complacency, he wanted excitement, even if it meant stirring up trouble. And that's exactly why he'd invited Zara to his home. Zara was different from the women Alex usually entertained. She was quiet, reserved, and had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. She was an attractive woman, yes, but there was more to her than just that. She didn't fawn over him the way others did. She didn't give him the admiration he was used to, and that intrigued him. There was something about her, something that made Alex feel as though he needed to break through her walls. He had a gift for making people feel small, for subtly manipulating their actions to get what he wanted. It was a game he played, one where he always won. But Zara was different. Alex had sensed it the moment she walked into the mansion for the first time, bringing with her the scent of fresh air and a quiet confidence that didn't fit the role of a mere housemaid. He'd quickly assessed that she was not intimidated by his wealth or power. Most people were, but not Zara. That was why he had invited her into his world, not as a maid, but as a player in his twisted little game. She arrived just after noon, walking through the grand entrance with a calm composure that only made Alex more curious. Dressed in a crisp black and white uniform, Zara carried herself with dignity, her eyes scanning the marble floors and towering columns as if she'd been here before. Alex couldn't help but notice how out of place she seemed in his opulent home. Everything about her, from her sharp posture to her calm demeanor, spoke of someone who had seen and lived through hardships that had made her tougher than the people Alex usually surrounded himself with. She wasn't here to admire his success, she was here to do a job, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that she had no interest in his wealth or charm. "Ms. Carter," she greeted him politely, using his last name as a reminder that she was here to work and nothing more. Alex found her professionalism both irritating and fascinating. "Please, call me Alex," he said, offering a charming smile. "I'm sure you'll find your work here quite comfortable. You're welcome to make yourself at home." Zara nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. Instead, she looked straight ahead as she walked into the grand hallway, her step steady and sure. Alex followed behind, intrigued by how she managed to carry herself with such grace despite being a part of his world now, a world that had always been dominated by the rich and powerful. Inside, the mansion was the epitome of wealth. Every room was a showcase of the finest art, rare furniture, and expensive decor. Yet, despite the luxury that filled every corner, there was a coldness about it, a disconnect that even the most beautiful things couldn't mask. The rooms were empty of warmth, absent of real connection. Alex had always been a solitary figure in his mansion. He led her to the kitchen, where the staff usually prepared meals for him, though most days he preferred to dine out. Zara began to set her things down as Alex watched her intently. His mind was already calculating, how could he get under her skin? How could he break that serene confidence she wore like a shield? It wasn't just a matter of having her clean his house or do his bidding, it was about testing her limits. Zara, he began casually, you've worked in other mansions, right? You must have seen a lot of different lifestyles. The following days unfolded with an eerie stillness that hung over the mansion like a heavy fog. Alex found himself growing more intrigued by Zara's composure, but he didn't want to admit it. His world had always been about power, about keeping everyone and everything in check. The people around him, especially those he employed, were simply tools for his ambitions. But Zara wasn't like the others. He had been used to people fawning over him, seeking his approval, but Zara was different. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't need anything. And that was exactly why Alex couldn't stop thinking about her. She had a quiet strength, one that Alex had trouble reading. It wasn't that she was standoffish, it was that she didn't seem to need him. Most people, he realized, were in his orbit because they needed something: validation, wealth, connections. But Zara was impervious to his influence, and that felt unsettling. As the days passed, Alex decided to test her. He started small, little things, like commanding her to do tasks outside her normal duties or sending her on errands that weren't part of her job. He'd watch her closely, waiting for her to falter, to show a sign of weakness, but it never came. One morning, as Zara cleaned the marble countertops in the kitchen, Alex strolled in, sipping on a cup of coffee. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. There was something mesmerizing about the way she moved, like a dancer gliding across the floor, each step purposeful, each motion fluid. Zara, he called out casually, you've been with us for a few days now. Tell me, do you find the mansion comfortable? She didn't look up from her task. It's fine, she replied, her tone neutral. She had a way of answering without revealing too much, but Alex knew that wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to see what was beneath that cool exterior. He took a few more steps toward her, standing just behind her now. I've noticed something about you, he said, his voice low, almost teasing. You don't seem awestruck by this place. By me. Most people can't help but be impressed by the luxury, by the lifestyle. But not you. What's your secret? She paused for a moment, as if considering his words. Then, without turning to face him, she responded. I've seen more important things than wealth. I've learned that the value of a person isn't determined by what they own, but by who they are. Alex smirked. He didn't buy into that philosophy, not for a second. People were only valuable if they could contribute to his world, his vision. But something in Zara's words, something in the way she spoke, made him question whether he had been looking at everything all wrong. She didn't care about his wealth. She didn't care about his power. She was different. But that only made Alex want to dig deeper. He was used to winning. He was used to being the one in control. But Zara was something entirely new. So, Alex ramped up his efforts. He started testing her more intentionally. He'd give her difficult tasks, ask her to do things in a way he knew would be a challenge. He wanted to see her crack. He wanted to see if there was any part of her that would bend to his will. But every time, Zara remained unfazed. She completed her tasks with the same quiet confidence, never flinching, never complaining. It began to frustrate Alex. He would watch her work, trying to decipher her. What was it about her that made her so unyielding? He had manipulated so many people in his life, friends, colleagues, even family, but Zara didn't seem to care about any of his games. She was a mystery that he couldn't solve, and that, in itself, was maddening. One evening, Alex decided to confront her head-on. He invited her to dinner, casually suggesting they discuss her work, but he had another motive. He wanted to get a read on her, wanted to see if he could uncover what made her tick. The grand dining room was lit with the soft glow of candlelight, the long table set for two. As Zara entered, she moved toward her seat with the same calm, collected demeanor she always displayed, but Alex noticed a slight shift in her posture. There was something different in her gaze, a quiet strength that caught him off guard. He offered her a seat and poured the wine, his eyes never leaving her. I've been thinking about you, Zara, he began, his tone light but probing. You've been here for almost a week, and I still don't know much about you. What makes you tick? Zara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a sip of her wine, studying him quietly, her eyes calculating. I'm not here to entertain you, Alex, she said finally, her voice steady. I'm here to work. If you want to know something about me, you'll have to ask. But I warn you, not everything is what it seems. There was a quiet challenge in her words, something that made Alex's pulse quicken. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't impressed. She was in control of this moment, not him. He leaned forward, intrigued. I don't think you understand, Zara. I don't need you to entertain me. But I do want to know what makes you tick. You're different from anyone I've met. Why is that? Zara set her glass down and met his gaze, her expression hardening. You think I'm different because you can't figure me out. But the truth is, I'm not the one with the problem here. You are. Alex blinked, surprised by her boldness. He wasn't used to people speaking to him this way, especially not in his own home. But there was a truth in her words that made him pause. What did she mean by that? She continued, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. You think you have power over everything and everyone around you, Alex. You think your wealth and influence give you control. But all you've done is surround yourself with people who let you believe that. You haven't faced anyone who sees through it all. Until now. Her words hit him like a blow, and for the first time in a long time, Alex felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible? Had he really been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who only catered to his ego? Could Zara really see through him? He wasn't sure, but in that moment, something inside him shifted. The game he thought he was playing, this manipulation, this need for control, suddenly felt insignificant. Zara looked at him one last time, her eyes softening just slightly. Don't mistake my silence for weakness, Alex. It's just that I don't need your approval. I don't need anything from you. And that, more than anything, is why you're so bothered by me. With that, she stood up and walked away, leaving Alex alone at the table, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in his life, Alex realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the one in control of this situation after all. And that realization, more than any game, any tactic, any manipulation, was the one thing that would change everything. As the days continued to unfold, Alex's internal world seemed to be in a constant state of upheaval. The once unshakable foundations of his life, his wealth, his control, his influence, now felt tenuous, as if something was eroding beneath the surface. Every encounter with Zara seemed to bring him closer to something he couldn't quite grasp. She had unknowingly become both his greatest challenge and his most intriguing mystery. Where other people were quick to fall in line, to praise his power and play the roles he assigned them, Zara remained steadfastly indifferent, unyielding in her self-sufficiency. It was a constant reminder of how little he truly understood her, how little anyone in his life seemed to matter beyond the scope of what they could provide for him. The more Alex tried to manipulate her, the more he failed. She didn't respond to his tests, his commands, or his subtle attempts to provoke a reaction. But it wasn't a resistance born from defiance alone. Zara had something deeper, something that made her untouchable. It was as if she existed in a different world altogether, a world where his money and status held no sway, a world where he didn't have the power to dictate the terms of her life. That realization began to gnaw at him, and the more it did, the more desperate he became to understand her. One evening, Alex found himself pacing the grand living room of his mansion, his mind swirling with frustration. He had tried everything to get under her skin, to find the cracks in her composed facade, but nothing seemed to work. She was like stone, unmoved, unshakable. And the more he thought about her, the more he realized that her presence had begun to infiltrate every aspect of his life. He couldn't sleep without thinking of her. Every conversation, every decision, seemed colored by the fact that Zara was always in the background, silent yet unavoidably present. It wasn't that Alex had become infatuated with her, at least not in the way one might expect. His fascination was something darker, an obsession with the way she had so effortlessly slipped under his radar, so calmly disrupted his carefully constructed world. It was as if Zara had become a mirror, reflecting all the parts of himself he had never allowed anyone to see. In her, he saw not just someone who was unaffected by his wealth and influence, but someone who had managed to carve out a space for herself in a world where those things were supposed to matter. The thought unsettled him, and that unease began to manifest in small ways. He found himself growing impatient with the people around him, feeling the sting of being questioned or challenged more sharply than he ever had before. In meetings, he grew frustrated when others didn't defer to him immediately, when they asked too many questions, when they didn't simply accept his decisions without argument. He realized that he had been living in a bubble, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants who catered to his every whim, and that bubble had just been punctured. Zara had done that. She had shown him the cracks in his own armor, the flaws in the world he had spent years building. It all came to a head one late afternoon when Zara entered the mansion carrying a stack of cleaning supplies. Alex was sitting at his desk, reviewing some contracts, when she stepped into his office without knocking. It wasn't that she was being rude, she had every right to enter, but it was the first time she had done so without following the usual protocol, without asking permission or waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. Something about that small act felt like another subtle rebellion, another challenge to his authority. It caught him off guard, and for the first time in a long while, Alex felt himself flinch. Zara didn't seem to notice his discomfort. She moved around the room with quiet efficiency, setting down her supplies and starting to clean. It was almost as if she had become a part of the space itself, seamlessly blending into the environment. As she moved, Alex couldn't help but watch her. There was something hypnotic about the way she worked, how focused she was, how completely absorbed in the task at hand. She didn't seem to care about his presence, about anything he could do for her. She was simply there. Existing. After a few minutes, Alex pushed his chair back, unable to remain in the silence any longer. "You don't need to do that in here," he said, his voice tense. Zara paused for a moment but didn't look up. "I do what needs to be done," she replied simply, her tone calm but unbothered. "I don't need you to clean my office," Alex insisted, his irritation rising. "This is my space. You don't have to be here." Zara turned then, finally meeting his gaze. There was no defiance in her expression, no anger. Just a quiet, unwavering calm that made Alex feel like he was the one out of place. "If you think this is just about cleaning, you're mistaken," she said. "I'm not here to serve you, Alex. I'm here to do what I'm paid to do. That's all." Alex opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. She was right. It wasn't about cleaning. It was about power, control, and something far deeper that he wasn't yet ready to confront. Zara had become a presence in his life that he couldn't dismiss, couldn't push aside. She had already woven herself into the fabric of his existence, and no amount of manipulation or force could change that. For the first time, Alex felt a deep sense of loss, an unsettling feeling that something precious was slipping through his fingers. He had built his entire life around the idea of control, of being the one who held the power in every situation. But Zara had shown him that true power wasn't about control, it was about understanding, about allowing people to exist in their own right without needing to dominate them. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was changing within him. It wasn't just his feelings toward Zara, though those were undeniably complicated. It was something more profound. The life he had so carefully constructed, the empire he had spent years building, now felt like a prison, a gilded cage that he had trapped himself inside. Zara had opened his eyes to a world beyond wealth, beyond influence. She had shown him that there was more to life than power. The following morning, Alex decided to take action. He didn't know what he expected to accomplish, but he couldn't let things continue this way. He found Zara cleaning the kitchen, her movements as graceful and purposeful as ever. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, trying to find the right words. "Zara," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "I think I've been wrong about a lot of things." She looked up, her eyes curious, but unreadable. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything and everyone around me," he continued, his words flowing more easily now. "But I've realized I've been missing something. Something that's been right in front of me all along." Zara set down the rag she had been using and took a step closer to him. "And what's that?" "The idea that maybe I don't need to control everything," Alex admitted. Maybe it's time I let go of the things that don't really matter." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Zara nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It's never easy to let go of control," she said. "But it's the only way to find out what really matters." And in that moment, Alex felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The realization that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, one that didn't rely on manipulation or dominance, but on understanding and growth. And that, he thought, was the beginning of something truly transformative. The next few weeks felt like a strange and subtle evolution for Alex. His interactions with Zara, once tense and filled with a quiet competition, now shifted into something far more complex. It wasn't that he had suddenly become a different person, no, Alex was still the same ambitious, driven millionaire he had always been. But the way he viewed the world, his relationships, and especially his dynamic with Zara, had irrevocably changed. It was as if the protective layers of his ego had started to peel away, revealing vulnerabilities he had long kept buried. For the first time, he began to wonder if power was something to be wielded carefully, or if it was a dangerous game, one that left everyone around him, himself included, feeling hollow and distant. Zara had become his paradox. She was unshakable, unaffected by the wealth and status that surrounded them both. In the past, he would have dismissed her as someone who simply didn't understand the stakes, someone who was beneath him, performing the role of a maid out of necessity. But now, he couldn't ignore the strength in her quiet resolve. She had never once asked for more than her job required, never once hinted at wanting anything other than her place in his home. And yet, she had forced him to confront himself in a way no one else had ever been able to. Alex found himself seeking her out, not because he wanted to control her, but because he needed to understand her. It was an odd reversal of roles. She had, without intending to, become his teacher. Every conversation with her left him feeling like there was still so much he didn't know, so much he had never allowed himself to learn. She had a quiet wisdom, a perspective on life that was both grounding and unsettling. He had spent years cultivating his wealth, building an empire with nothing but his determination and sharp intellect, but it was clear to him now that he had been blind to the deeper, more meaningful aspects of life. Zara, in her simple honesty, had shown him a world that didn't revolve around power or material success. One afternoon, Alex asked her to join him for a coffee in the garden. It was the first time he had ever extended such an invitation to her, and he wasn't entirely sure why he was doing it. He knew it wasn't for business, it wasn't to discuss any chores or expectations. It was just a moment of curiosity. He wanted to know more about her. He wanted to understand the person who had unknowingly flipped his world upside down. Zara accepted without hesitation, and they sat in the shade of a large oak tree, the air still and warm. Alex had noticed that Zara had begun to relax around him more, as if she had picked up on his change, sensing that he was no longer the same man who had brought her into his life with ulterior motives. It wasn't that she had softened, no, she remained as composed and self-assured as ever. But there was a subtle shift in the way she interacted with him. She no longer looked at him with the cautious wariness she once did. Now, she regarded him with something akin to quiet acknowledgement, as if the walls she had built around herself were starting to come down, piece by piece. "So," Alex said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about our conversations. About how you see the world, about how you see me." He paused, feeling a bit unsure of where he was going with this. "I've spent my life in a bubble, surrounded by people who want something from me, people who bend to my will because of what I can offer. But you," he gestured at her, "you don't need anything from me. You don't care about any of that. Zara raised an eyebrow. That's true. But I'm not immune to it either. I'm just not interested in it. I've learned that what really matters isn't what someone has, but who they are. Alex felt a pang in his chest. It was as if she had exposed a raw nerve he hadn't known was there. Who they are. He had spent so much of his life building an identity based on what he had, on what he could command, that he had never really stopped to ask himself who he actually was beneath it all. Who was he without the money, the mansion, the power? Had he been hiding behind all of those things to cover up a deeper fear, that he wasn't enough as he truly was? I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Alex admitted, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. I've spent so long thinking that I could control everything, that I could buy everything, but I'm starting to realize I've been missing something. Zara didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't judge him, didn't pity him. She simply listened, as if she had heard this confession many times before, from people far more important than him. Control isn't everything, she said after a long pause. You can control your world, Alex. You can control what people do, what they say, but you can't control who they are. And sometimes, it's that surrender to what you can't control that teaches you the most. It's in letting go, in allowing things to unfold naturally, that you find your true strength. Her words struck him deeply. There it was again, that quiet wisdom. She wasn't saying anything he hadn't heard before, but for some reason, the way she said it made it feel new, as if it was something he needed to hear in this moment of his life. I've been afraid of letting go, Alex admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Afraid that if I stop controlling everything, I'll lose it all. I'll lose who I am. Zara's gaze softened, and she placed her cup down, leaning forward slightly. But that's the thing. You haven't lost yourself, Alex. You've just been hiding behind a version of yourself that you think people want to see. Maybe it's time to stop pretending, to stop performing. The weight of her words pressed down on him, and for the first time, Alex felt a kind of liberation that was almost terrifying. What if she was right? What if his entire life had been built on an illusion? He had spent so much time trying to construct a persona that others would admire, that he had forgotten what it meant to just be himself. He had always told himself that he was above the small things, that emotions were for the weak, that vulnerability was a sign of failure. But Zara had shown him otherwise. Do you think it's too late? Alex asked, almost as if testing her, seeking reassurance that it wasn't too late to change, to become someone else, someone better. Zara took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. It's never too late to change, Alex. But it starts with you. You have to be willing to see yourself for who you are, flaws and all. Only then can you start to rebuild. For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of her words lingering between them. Alex felt a strange peace settle over him. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but it was something profound nonetheless. He had always believed that he needed to control everything to feel powerful, to feel safe. But now, in the presence of Zara's quiet strength, he understood that true power wasn't in domination. It was in the ability to let go and trust. Trust that things would unfold as they should, that his worth wasn't tied to his money or influence, and that, perhaps for the first time, he could just be himself. When they stood up to leave the garden, the sky had turned a pale orange, the sun dipping below the horizon. Zara's figure was framed by the last light of the day, her silhouette calm and composed. Alex watched her for a moment, feeling something stir deep within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. As she walked back toward the house, Alex took a deep breath, feeling as if he had just taken the first step on a new path. One that didn't involve control, but growth. And maybe, just maybe, it was the right path for him after all. The days following his conversation with Zara were filled with a strange mix of relief and discomfort. Alex had always prided himself on his ability to be in control of every aspect of his life. He had spent years, even decades, building a fortress of power around himself, an empire that no one could breach. But now, After that quiet moment in the garden, things began to shift, and he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. It wasn't just about his wealth or his position anymore. It was about something much deeper. Something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. But the more he reflected on his life, the more he realized how much of it had been defined by fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of being exposed as someone who wasn't perfect, who wasn't invincible. Zara had unwittingly given him the courage to look beyond his carefully constructed walls and see the person he had been hiding. She had shown him that it was okay to not have all the answers, that there was strength in admitting uncertainty. The truth was, Alex had never really known who he was outside of his wealth and status. For so long, he had used those things to define himself, to measure his worth. And now, as the days passed, he felt a growing sense of disconnection from the very life he had built. It was like a fog lifting from his eyes, revealing a world he had never truly seen. But that didn't mean it was easy. In fact, it was harder than Alex had imagined. Letting go of control, relinquishing the tight grip he had on his life, felt like a slow, painful unraveling. Each day seemed to present new challenges, moments when his old impulses resurfaced, urging him to revert to his old ways. The old Alex, the one who believed power was everything, was always just a thought away, ready to take over and reclaim the reins of his life. But something inside him resisted. The more he interacted with Zara, the more he saw her as a symbol of something he had longed for without realizing it: authenticity. She didn't hide behind masks or pretenses. She was real, raw, and honest. She had no agenda, no need for validation. She was simply herself. And that, in itself, was a kind of strength that Alex could never quite understand before. It was a few weeks after their conversation in the garden when Alex found himself in a particularly dark place. His empire was still thriving, his business ventures were still as profitable as ever, but the more successful he became, the more empty he felt. He had achieved everything he set out to accomplish, and yet, in the quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded away, he realized he was still searching for something. Something deeper. He thought of Zara again, and how she had somehow managed to find peace in a life so vastly different from his own. She had no need for the lavish trappings that he surrounded himself with, no need for the constant validation that he craved. It was as if she had figured out a secret that he hadn't yet learned. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Alex found himself sitting alone in his study, staring out at the sprawling estate that had once brought him a sense of pride. But tonight, it felt different. The mansion that had always been a symbol of his success now felt like a cage, its walls closing in around him. He didn't want to live in a world where his worth was measured by his net worth, where the only currency that mattered was money. He wanted more. He needed more. But what was that more? And how could he find it? He needed answers, and for the first time in his life, he knew where to turn. Zara. It was a strange thing, this pull he felt toward her. In the past, he had seen her only as an employee, a figure who existed at the periphery of his life. But now, she had become a pivotal part of his journey, a guide in a world he no longer recognized. He needed her perspective. He needed her to help him understand the truth that was beginning to take root in his heart. The next morning, Alex summoned Zara to the office, his tone serious, but not commanding. When she entered, there was no hesitation in her step. She simply stood in front of him, waiting for him to speak. It was that quiet confidence in her demeanor that made Alex respect her more than anyone else in his life. "I need your help," Alex said, his voice steady but carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. Zara's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained unchanged. "You've already helped me more than you know," Alex continued, looking her directly in the eye. "But there's something I need to understand. I've spent my whole life chasing power and control. I've built a world around that. But now, it's like I've realized none of that matters. I don't want to be that person anymore. I need to figure out who I am without all of this." He gestured to the room, the mansion, the wealth that filled every corner of his life. Zara didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply observed him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Then, she spoke, her voice calm and composed. "I can't tell you who you are, Alex. That's something only you can figure out. But I can tell you that it starts with being honest with yourself. Letting go of the need to control everything. The world won't fall apart if you allow yourself to be imperfect." Alex felt a lump form in his throat. The simplicity of her words struck him deeply, and for a moment, he found himself lost in the weight of it all. He had spent so many years trying to be perfect, trying to control every aspect of his life, that he had forgotten what it was like to be human. To be vulnerable. To be real. "It's not easy," Alex admitted, his voice quieter now. "I've spent so long building walls around myself that I don't know how to take them down." Zara's gaze softened. "The walls aren't as strong as you think. You've been holding yourself prisoner, but you have the key. You just have to use it." In that moment, something inside Alex clicked. It wasn't a dramatic epiphany, but rather a quiet realization that he had the power to change. To break free from the chains he had placed on himself. He wasn't trapped by his wealth or his status. He was trapped by his own fears, his own need for control. And those fears could only be conquered by embracing the uncertainty that came with living a more authentic life. The weeks that followed were filled with slow, difficult steps. Alex didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't have a clear path ahead of him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He began to shed the layers of his old identity, bit by bit. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but he started to embrace the idea of vulnerability, of living without the constant need to prove himself. He made small changes. He began spending more time with his family, reconnecting with people who didn't care about his money or status. He started to give back to the community, using his wealth in ways that actually meant something. And through it all, Zara remained a steady presence in his life. She never pressured him, never asked for anything. But her quiet strength, her calm perspective, had become the anchor he never knew he needed. One evening, as Alex sat in the garden once more, reflecting on the changes he had made, he realized how far he had come. He wasn't perfect, not by any means, but he was no longer the man he had once been. He had taken his first steps toward becoming someone more real, someone who didn't need to hide behind wealth or power. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. In the distance, Zara's figure appeared, walking towards him with that same quiet confidence. As she approached, Alex smiled softly, knowing that, though he had a long way to go, he was no longer walking this path alone. And that, more than anything, made all the difference. As Alex continued to shed the layers of his old identity, he found himself confronting a deeper, more complex question that had always lingered in the background: what did he really want from life? For years, he had been on a relentless pursuit of success, measured by wealth, influence, and power. These were the markers that defined his existence. But now, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect, he realized how hollow those pursuits had become. The more he focused on external validation, the more disconnected he felt from himself, and from the people around him. This internal struggle began to erode the fortress he had so carefully built. He spent hours contemplating the life he had led, the choices he had made, and the relationships he had neglected. His mind often drifted back to the first conversation he had with Zara in the garden. It had been a simple exchange, yet it had unlocked something in him that he couldn't ignore. Zara's presence in his life wasn't just about her role in his household, it was something much more profound. She had challenged his understanding of what it meant to be strong, to be successful, and to truly live. And the more he reflected on her words, the more he realized that the trap he had feared, his own trap, wasn't one of physical walls or external threats. It was the trap of his own making, built from his obsession with control and perfection. There were days when Alex felt lost, unsure of the path he was on. His life no longer felt clear-cut, and his decisions were no longer driven solely by financial gain or business triumphs. But that uncertainty wasn't as frightening as he once thought it would be. In fact, it felt freeing. He had always believed that clarity came from having a set plan, a clear direction, but now he was discovering that true clarity often arose from embracing the unknown, from stepping into the fog and trusting that, eventually, the way forward would reveal itself. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of his old life pressed down on him. The temptation to return to his former self, someone who thrived on control, who measured success by the numbers in his bank account or the power he wielded, was always there, just beneath the surface. But with each passing day, he grew more resistant to it. He began to trust in the small moments, the moments where the world seemed to pause, and he could just breathe, just be. Whether it was sitting in his study, reading a book, or having a conversation with Zara about something completely unrelated to business, those were the moments where he felt most alive, most himself. Zara, in her quiet wisdom, had become more than just a figure in his life. She had become a mirror, reflecting back to him the parts of himself he had long neglected. She never asked for anything from him, never sought validation. She was simply there, with her own unique perspective on the world. Alex began to see that her life wasn't one of grandiose plans or elaborate success stories, but rather a life of simple truths. Zara had a way of living that didn't rely on external approval or praise. She found satisfaction in the small things, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, the joy of helping others, and the peace that came from knowing she was living in alignment with her values. In the midst of all these realizations, Alex started to make some changes. They were small at first, letting go of a few projects, pulling back from meetings that no longer felt meaningful. He stopped obsessing over every financial detail and began focusing on the bigger picture. He reached out to old friends, not for business opportunities, but just to reconnect. For the first time in years, he attended social events that weren't centered around power or influence, but simply about human connection. It was uncomfortable at times, but it also felt right. He realized that true happiness wasn't in the next big deal or the next luxury purchase. It was in the relationships he fostered, in the kindness he offered, and in the way he learned to be present in the moment. However, one of the biggest shifts came when he made the decision to start giving back in a meaningful way. For so long, he had viewed charity as just another business transaction, a way to bolster his image or gain favor in certain circles. But now, Alex wanted to contribute in ways that were authentic, ways that didn't come with strings attached. He didn't want to be the millionaire who donated for tax breaks or to elevate his status. He wanted to make a real difference, even if it was on a smaller scale. He began funding local programs, not for recognition, but because he believed in the causes. He found himself sitting in community meetings, speaking with people who had very little, but who gave everything they had to help others. He learned more about the struggles they faced, about the needs in his own community that he had never noticed before. Zara's influence had played a huge role in these changes. She never pushed him to take action, but simply showed him the value of being grounded, of having a life beyond the confines of wealth and success. She had always been a part of the community, in ways that Alex had never understood until now. Watching her, Alex began to understand the difference between success as defined by the world, and success as defined by one's own sense of purpose. It wasn't about accumulation, it was about contribution. The more Alex gave, the more he felt himself transforming. There was a lightness to his spirit that he hadn't felt in years. The more he embraced this new way of living, the more his past self seemed like a distant memory. The moments of quiet reflection, the simplicity of human connection, and the act of giving without expecting anything in return, became his new currency. As he sat in his office one evening, staring out at the estate he had once considered the pinnacle of his success, he realized that it no longer felt like home. This mansion, this wealth, no longer defined him. What mattered now were the people in his life, the choices he made, and the purpose he had found in living authentically. Zara was more than just an employee, she had become his guide, his companion on this journey toward self-discovery. Their relationship had evolved into something beautiful and unexpected, built on trust and mutual respect. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They had come to understand each other in a way that words could hardly capture. As time passed, Alex continued to live with intention. His business flourished, but now he measured success by the impact he had on others, by the way he used his influence to create positive change. He no longer sought out the accolades or the praise that once fueled him. He had found peace in his own skin, and that peace came not from perfection, but from acceptance, accepting that life was messy, unpredictable, and often out of his control. And for the first time, he was okay with that. The mansion, the wealth, the status, none of it defined him anymore. What defined him now was the person he had become. And in that realization, Alex found a sense of freedom that he had never known before. It was a freedom that came from living authentically, from allowing himself to be vulnerable, and from embracing the uncertainty of life with open arms. And with Zara by his side, he knew that this new journey was just beginning. The man who had once been trapped by his own ambition had now found the courage to live for something greater, a life that was real, a life that was his own.